Eternal Champions has been stuck on my mind lately. Beyond the game itself, I've been doing a lot of thinking about how that franchise was canned so that Virtua Fighter could thrive. It bothers me a lot when something good is shafted in favor of something else, but I really have been too quick on the jump to judge Virtua Fighter. My only experience with the series is the limited exposure to 2 that I suffered through for my last video, so today we're going to take a look at Virtua Fighter 1 through 5 to see if my preemptive negativity was justified or not. I won't be digging into any spin-offs, and I won't be going deep into the differences between alternate versions of the same games. I'll only be playing one version of each of the 5 titles. Let's get started. First game up today is the original Virtua Fighter, originally released in arcades in 1993. The version we're playing today is the Sega 32X port released in 1995. The reason I chose this port of the game, despite the obvious graphical downgrade from the other ports, is because it's officially the least buggy and personally the easiest to emulate. Before I even talk about the game itself, I need to give some attention to the legacy. Virtua Fighter is the first 3D fighting game, and often takes credit as the inspiration for a myriad of totally unrelated 3D games. John Romero's original idea for Quake was effectively Virtua Fighter in an adventure setting, but with Quake stuff going on. Imagine the exact same game as the original Quake, but every once in a while you get pulled into a third-person view for melee combat. It also served as an inspiration for pretty much every early use of polygon characters, and even the original PS1 graphics hardware was heavily inspired by it. So with a legacy like that, you're probably thinking, this game must be awesome, right? Well, it isn't a bad game, but it's far from being amazing. Technically speaking, the 3D fighter aspects are cool. My biggest complaint with Street Fighter EX was that the stages were all flat billboard backdrops with a ground plane, but here I understand it a lot more. This is the earliest fighting game of its kind, so it's a lot more forgivable to not have very complex stages. The character models don't look good at all by today's standards, but at the time, this was the only game with graphics like this, so that's also pretty forgivable. This specific port, in my opinion, looks the best. Not because it has the highest fidelity, the opposite actually. The Sega 32X doesn't have any anti-aliasing, and a lot of the time that works in favor of the characters. With this specific port, everything looks more stylized and a lot less dated. No matter how it looks, something that definitely feels dated is the fighting. At a solid 30 frames a second, Virtua Fighter uses 3 buttons: 1 punch, 1 kick, and 1 block. I don't necessarily have a problem with a good 3-button fighter, but this one is particularly brainless. They put a lot of emphasis on real-world fighting styles and the differences between character strategies, but none of that matters at all. The bulk of the game amounts to mashing the punch button a few times, ending with a kick, and then blocking once in a while. Feel free to experiment with any number of things, but you'll never have as much success as you do if you just mash buttons. Characters do feel very different from each other, but they don't control any differently. Every character has a unique fighting style, and that means the sequence in which you punch and kick a dude is sometimes different depending on that. You can also tap a direction and an attack button at the same time, and sometimes there's a different attack for that direction. It doesn't change the core strategy of mash buttons, but it does add a tiny amount of optional depth to an otherwise brainless experience. If I can give it one thing, it feels a lot snappier than some other fighting games I've played, and it definitely still is easy enough to play today, but that doesn't mean it's very good. This is one of those games where I can see why it was good to play at the time, and it definitely was revolutionary, but I wouldn't recommend playing it today. I think it's better to leave it and remember the impact that it made on video games as a whole. With that in mind, I'll give it a quick rating of 6 out of 10. Revolutionary? Sure, but that doesn't make it the best example of its own ideas. Next up today is Virtua Fighter 2, originally released in arcades in 1994. The version we're playing today is the Sega Saturn port released in 1995. I didn't pick this port for any other reason than I already had it, and I've already spent a little bit of time playing it. I looked at the Sega Genesis port of Virtua Fighter 2 in my last video, but I don't think that's a good representation of the real Virtua Fighter 2, so we'll dig into this one a little bit. First and most notable thing about this game is that it made a shit ton of money. For 2 concurrent years in Japan, Virtua Fighter 2 was the most successful arcade cabinet. Millions of people pre-ordered this game at a time when pre-orders weren't nearly so common. Every outlet under the sun gave it a near-perfect rating, citing the many advancements it makes over its predecessor. You're probably thinking, this game has to be really good, right? Like top tier, one of the most legendary games ever made? I mean, no, not really. There are definitely things this game does better than its predecessor. There are more moves, there's more complexity to the fighting styles, and it looks a lot better. The first Virtua Fighter ran at 30 frames a second, and this one runs at 60, which means the actual fighting is a lot more fluid without losing any of the snappiness, but it's still extremely simple, and a lot of the fights can be won by just mashing buttons and alternating between them once in a while. There's a definite complexity to the game buried in there, but it's all entirely optional. The fact that every other part of the game is overcomplicated to the point of hurting the gameplay really bothers me. Say what you will about the original Tekken, but that game really did take advantage of the 3D space for all of the fighters. In that, you can't brainlessly mash buttons and hope to win. In this, you don't really have to strategize much at all. Once you've got the pattern and the timing down, there's not much fighting to do. I think now is a good time to bring up my least least favorite system in the Virtua Fighter series. Ring out is a good idea in concept, but in practice it just doesn't work here. Fights already go really fast, and the ring out system makes them go even faster. There are moments where you'll be fighting for literally a few seconds before the round is over and you're waiting through another loading screen. This makes the game feel extremely boring sometimes, and because of that, there's a lot of wasted time between short bursts of good gameplay. All of that said, I think I feel comfortable giving this game a rating of 5 out of 10. It is a copy of the first game, with a higher frame rate, more polygons, and a couple of extra moves that don't even matter. I felt extremely bored playing after just a few minutes, and I think that's a testament to the lack of complexity in the gameplay and the overcomplicated animation. It's fine, but it's just the same game with fewer innovative concepts, and I can only assume the love for it comes from how ultra-casual it feels, plus the nostalgia. Next up, Virtua Fighter 3 TB. 3 terabytes? 3 tuberculosis? Actually, the TB stands for Team Battle, which I guess is neat, but we aren't even gonna fuck with it. Instead, I spent my time playing this game in Original Mode. Originally released in 1996 in arcades, and then again for the Dreamcast in 1998. Virtua Fighter 3 is the first game in the series to feature the inclusion of a fourth button, the dodge. I know this is gonna sound ridiculous, but it's honestly the biggest update this game could get. Virtua Fighter prides itself on being a 3D fighter with heavy emphasis on the D, but up until this point it's been restricted to being a 2D fighter with 3D imagery. Doing some moves in previous games would rotate the stage, but it was only a few, and only some characters could do that. Here, the greater variety of moves and combos combined with the heavier emphasis on navigating a more complex 3D stage actually adds a lot more real depth to the fighting. This is so superior to the first two that they aren't even comparable. It's not very hard at default difficulty. That can be fixed by just raising the difficulty in the options, and from there, this is a really good in-depth 3D fighter. I think the only problem now is the lack of any real memorability or personality. The roster of characters is all the same as the last two, and the only ones I keep in my mind are Dollar Store Ryu, the ninja, and the boss. The stages are more memorable here than they are in other games, and they do something that I don't think I've seen in any other fighting games. Each of the stage has a different vertical behavior. Some of them have hills, some of them are flat, some of them are tilted to one direction, some of them bob and shake. The stage itself is acting as a part of the overall fight by using those different vertical heights to warp your perspective, and that's a really cool idea. I think a little bit of refinement could go a long way, but this game overall has been a huge step in the right direction. I actually feel a little bit better about Eternal Champions. Not totally, but a little. With that in mind, I feel comfortable giving this game a rating of 8 out of 10. It's probably one of the most impressive displays of 3D rendering technology to come out of the 90s, and it's really good. There are a lot of really good ideas here. It's not one of the best fighting games I've ever played, but damn, it's a lot more fun than the first two were. Next, Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution is a derivative of Virtua Fighter 4 that originally released on PlayStation 2 in 2002 and then later that same year in arcades. The dodge button is gone, and in its place we now have free stage navigation. There are also 2 punch and 2 kick buttons, as well as a dedicated grab button, so the control scheme's seen a bit of an upgrade from the predecessor depending on how you look at things. Personally, I think the dodge button was fine, but I'm not going to complain about some extra depth and functionality. Fundamentally, it's the same as the last few Virtua Fighter titles, but with a larger roster of characters, more moves, more combos, better character models, and more fluid animation. One thing I will complain about is the total backtrack and stage design. Stages have gone back to being a flat square with a tight ring-out boundary. Rather than the cool, variously shaped stages with different vertical heights of the predecessor, this game doesn't feel nearly as good to play as 3. But that doesn't mean it isn't still good. It's still better than the original 2 by a long shot, and there's a very fluid, good-looking fighting game here. The snappiness is a lot less snappy, if that makes sense. Things don't have the same weight to their impacts like they did before, with a couple of exceptions, and it feels a lot more floaty than fighty. Like, I understand that the moves are based on various martial arts, and the choreography is faithful to that, but the actual weight of the impacts doesn't do the choreography any justice. I think this is a good time to mention that this game, as well as its predecessors, have had some pretty great music. It's mostly upbeat rock stuff, but it feels like it's precisely stylized to fit the moods and themes of the game. The first two were fine, but these two slap and are worth a listen. With all of that in mind, I think I feel comfortable giving this game a rating of 7 out of 10. It's nowhere near as fun as 3, and the backtracking with the stage design is really a blow to the whole thing, but it isn't a bad game by any means. It's fully playable, the characters have good diverse movesets, and it looks pretty good considering this was from 2002. Final game today is Virtua Fighter 5, released in arcades in 2006. The port we're playing today is the PS3 port of the game, and the most notable difference between it and the Xbox 360 port is the lack of an online multiplayer. Virtua Fighter 5 on PS3 restricts any multiplayer to the good old-fashioned couch. That's fine, it's not as if I would go looking for an online lobby in a fighting game from 2006 anyway, so no big loss. This game is almost exactly the same as last time, but with a few changes that actually make it feel better to play. This time around, all of the stages are made differently. They're still flat, for sure, but some of them are much more open than others. Some of them look really good. Visually speaking, this game is absolutely stunning for 2006. Everything looks fantastic, and the different little things like hair physics or depth in the clothing fabric really stood out. There are even more moves to use this time, and that lack of weight and impact from the last game has all been fixed. All of the actual fighting here feels really good. Every character feels noticeably different, which is common for these games, but this time it isn't just the weight and the moveset that's different. The actual way you fight feels a lot more diverse, with the enemy AI forcing you to be more creative. I'm honestly shocked. I didn't think I liked the direction of 4 very much, but with a few choice refinements, this game does everything 4 does but better. One of the best things about fighting games is that, at a fundamental level, you don't need to reinvent the wheel every time you release a new game. You can take the things that work, just polish the fuck out of everything, and once everything's said and done, you end up with a solid fighting game. Virtua Fighter 5 was the last entry in the series, and the reason for that from the director himself was there was a lack of innovation. But there doesn't need to be innovation. The game itself works perfectly fine, and the team should focus on how to keep what's so great about it and just make it look and feel better. Include some new visual effects, like more noticeably damaged clothing, or wounds depending on what part of the body has been struck the hardest. Add more moves to the movesets of the characters. Add more characters like, oh, I don't know, the Eternal Champions roster. If Sega put the effort into just making this game again, but better, then there would definitely be room among the modern fighting game set for it to exist with a solid player base. With everything in mind, I think I feel comfortable giving this game a rating of a solid 8 out of 10. It takes almost every good idea from the series and executes it so well that I personally think it's the best entry. Of course there's room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. Sega kinda gauged the waters for a new Virtua Fighter back in 2021 with the release of 5 Ultimate Showdown, but then they fucked it up completely by only releasing it on PS4. Limiting the release of the game to 1/4 of the market is a shit tier move that alienates the potential player base. The biggest market share for fighting games is PC, with console players taking up the rear even behind mobile. If you cut the base of console players down to just 1/3 of the available options by making the game exclusive to just one console, then all you're doing is losing money because you're not even hitting close to the amount of players who would be playing it. There's no benefit to being a console exclusive in a PC-dominated market, and that was Virtua Fighter 1 through 5. All of the games were good to some degree, with the weakest entry in the series hands down being Virtua Fighter 2. I'm not sure whether or not that's a controversial opinion, but I don't really care. I'm just relaying my experience without the taint of nostalgia that many of my millennial predecessors base themselves on. If you were a kid in the 90s and you grew up playing Virtua Fighter 2, and I've somehow offended you by saying that I don't like it, then that really is a you problem. The fact of the matter is that many other games from that time period are superior in gameplay and style, and I'm confident in saying that because lately I've played so many of them. Every other game in the series was great for one reason or another, and I definitely plan on returning to 5 Ultimate Showdown if it ever gets a PC re-release. But for now I feel fulfilled enough knowing that I just gave them a chance at all. In hindsight, this experience could have been extremely negative. I could have been more pissed about Eternal Champions, and I could have been a Tekken elitist or something, but I really wanted to be fair to these games. I kept wanting to draw comparisons to Tekken, but outside of the visuals and the 3D stage navigation, there are no similarities there. Virtua Fighter is a good game for its own reasons, and it gradually got better as time went on. I'm glad I played them. Thank you, and have a nice day.